The phone rang at 11 at night, and the number on the screen belonged to a hospital I had never called in my life. And somehow I already knew, before the nurse even finished her first sentence, that whatever she was about to tell me would split my life cleanly into a before and an after. My name is Daniel Ortiz. I am 31 years old, and the man who raised me, fed me, coached my little league team, and sat in a folding chair outside every hospital room of my childhood. Asthma attacks was a man named Robert Ortiz, the only father I had ever known or wanted to know. The nurse told me, in a calm and measured voice, that my father had collapsed suddenly at work, that his kidneys were failing rapidly, and that, without a transplant within a matter of months, he would be gone. And I remember gripping the kitchen counter so hard my knuckles went white while she explained words like end-stage renal disease as if they were ordinary weather. I drove to the hospital that same night doing 80 on an empty highway, replaying every single memory I had of Robert Ortiz teaching me to ride a bike, to tie a tie for my first job interview, to change a tire on the side of the road in the rain, because none of those memories had ever once needed a blood test to prove they were real. When I got there, he was propped up in a hospital bed, looking smaller than I had ever seen him, and he grabbed my hand with a grip that was somehow still strong and told me, before I could even ask, that I was absolutely not allowed to feel guilty about anything that was about to happen to him. The doctors explained that a living donor kidney was his best chance, that a family member was often the strongest match, and that the very first person they wanted to test, given how healthy I was and how close our relationship had always been, was me, his only son, the boy he had raised alone since I was 4 years old after my mother left and never looked back. I said yes before the doctor even finished the sentence, because that is simply what you do for the man who raised you, the man who worked two jobs so I could play travel soccer, the man who never once, not for a single day of my childhood, made me feel like I was anything less than entirely and completely his. To understand why any of this mattered so much, you have to understand exactly what kind of father Robert Ortiz actually was, not in some vague sentimental way, but in specific, concrete, everyday terms, the kind of details that only accumulate inside a real relationship built over decades rather than a single dramatic gesture. He was the man who woke up at 5 every single morning for 11 straight years to work a shift at a printing warehouse before driving 40 minutes across town to pick me up from school himself rather than let me ride the bus because, he said more than once, that those 20 quiet minutes in the car were the only guaranteed time he had with me. Some weeks, he was the man who learned entirely from library books how to braid hair when I was 7 and going through a brief phase of wanting cornrows like the older kids at my school, sitting on the edge of the bathtub for 40 minutes on a Sunday night, patiently failing and trying again until he finally got it right. He never remarried, never seriously dated anyone for more than a few months at a time, and when I once asked him as a teenager why he never seemed to want anyone else in his life the way other single fathers eventually did, he told me simply that he had already gotten the best part of his life, meaning me, and that everything else felt optional by comparison. Kidney disease, the doctors explained to us in that first overwhelming week, is often called a silent condition because it can progress for years without obvious symptoms, the kidneys quietly losing function while a person feels essentially normal until suddenly, one ordinary Tuesday, they do not. And Robert's collapse at work was exactly that kind of sudden, terrifying arrival of a problem that had apparently been building for a very long time. The testing process, they told me, would take about 2 weeks, blood typing first, then something called HLA typing, human leukocyte antigen markers, tissue compatibility tests designed to measure not just whether our blood matched, but whether our bodies were genetically similar enough for his immune system to accept a piece of mine without rejecting it violently. I remember the nurse drawing my blood, explaining, almost casually, that biological children are often, though not always, among the strongest possible matches for a parent, since half of a child's genetic material comes directly from that exact parent, a fact I filed away without much thought because it had. Honestly, never once crossed my mind that Robert Ortiz might not be my biological father, not even for a passing second. The 2 weeks of waiting were the longest of my entire life, filled with hospital visits, filled with watching a man who used to carry me on his shoulders, now struggling to walk from his bed to the bathroom, filled with a strange new fear I had never experienced before, the fear of losing the only parent who had ever truly shown up for me. On the day the results were supposed to come back, the transplant coordinator, a calm woman named Dr. Patel, who had clearly delivered difficult news more times than she could count, asked me to come into a small private office instead of discussing anything over the phone, which should have told me immediately that something unusual was happening. She opened with the kind of gentle preamble doctors use right before they say something that will rearrange your entire understanding of your own life, telling me that my blood type was compatible, technically, but that the more detailed genetic panel had returned results that, in her words, did not make biological sense given the relationship I had described to the intake team. I asked her what that meant exactly, my heart already pounding in a way that told me some quiet, unsuspecting part of me had somehow braced for this before my conscious mind had even caught up, and she said the words slowly and carefully, the way you hand someone something breakable, that the genetic markers showed a 0% probability that Robert Ortiz was my biological father. I laughed, actually laughed, a short disbelieving bark of a sound, because it seemed like the kind of mistake a lab makes, a mixed-up sample, a clerical error, anything other than the actual truth. And I told her flatly that there had to be some kind of mix-up, that this man had raised me since I was 4 years old, that I had his exact same crooked smile in every single photograph of us. Dr. Patel, to her credit, did not flinch or argue. She simply explained patiently that genetic paternity testing at this level of precision was essentially conclusive, that laboratory errors of this specific magnitude were exceptionally rare, and that whatever the explanation turned out to be, it was not a filing mistake. It was something that had happened in my family long before I was ever old enough to remember any of it. She told me something else that afternoon that I have never forgotten, a statistic she said she shared carefully and only when a patient truly needed context, that studies on non-paternity events, cases where a man raising a child is not that child's biological father, suggest the rate is far higher across the general population than most people would ever guess, often estimated somewhere between 1% and 3% of all births, a number that sounds small until you realize how many ordinary, loving families it quietly touches without anyone ever finding out. She explained further that most of these situations never surface at all, that people live entire lives never once learning the truth, and that the only reason mine had come to light was the specific, narrow coincidence of needing an HLA compatibility panel run for a kidney transplant, a level of genetic detail no ordinary birth certificate or family photograph could ever have revealed on its own. I remember asking her, almost desperately, whether there was any chance at all. The lab had simply confused 2 samples somewhere along the way, and she told me gently that the panel had been run twice independently, using 2 separate blood draws taken on 2 different days specifically to rule out exactly that possibility before any result like this was ever shared with a patient. I sat in that small office for a long time after she left, staring at a wall calendar with a stock photo of a mountain lake, trying to reconcile 2 facts that refused to sit peacefully next to each other, the fact that Robert Ortiz was, in every single meaningful way, my father, and the fact that biologically, apparently, he was not. I did not go back into his hospital room that day. I could not yet. I drove instead to my mother's small apartment across town, the mother who had left when I was 4 and reappeared sporadically over the years with the kind of unreliable warmth that always left more questions than comfort, and I stood on her doorstep for a full minute before I even knocked, When she opened the door and saw my face, something shifted immediately in her own expression, a kind of resigned recognition, as if some part of her had been waiting for this exact conversation for 27 years, and had simply hoped, the way people hope about things they know are inevitable, that it would somehow never actually arrive. I told her what the doctor said, watching her face carefully for the shock I expected, the confusion, the demand for a second opinion, and instead I got something far more devastating. I got silence, followed by her sitting down slowly at her kitchen table and telling me in a voice smaller than I had ever heard from her that she had always wondered if this day would come. She told me that in the year before I was born, she and Robert had been going through a difficult stretch, barely speaking some weeks, and that during that stretch she had a brief relationship with a coworker named Victor Suarez, a relationship she ended almost immediately once things settled with Robert, believing, hoping, praying in the specific desperate way you pray about things you cannot control, that the timing worked out in Robert's favor. She said when I was born, looking in her words, unmistakably like a Suarez, she made a decision in the first exhausted week of motherhood that she told herself for 27 years had been the right one, to never tell Robert, to let him raise me as his own, to bury the truth so deep that even she eventually stopped consciously thinking about it most days. I asked her, my voice shaking in a way I barely recognized, whether Robert had ever suspected, and she said no, never once, that he had loved me so completely. And so immediately from the moment I was born, that the thought apparently never crossed his mind, and that watching that love for 27 years had been, for her, both the greatest relief of her life and its quietest, heaviest guilt, she told me. She remembered the exact day she decided never to tell him, a Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks after I was born, when Robert had come home from work exhausted and immediately dropped to his knees beside my crib just to watch me sleep for almost 20 minutes without saying a single word, and she said watching that moment made the decision for her before she had even consciously finished making it. She admitted, quietly, that there had been moments over the years, birthdays mostly, when she almost told him, when the guilt sat so heavily in her chest that she rehearsed the actual sentences in her head while driving to family gatherings, but that she always talked herself out of it at the last possible moment, telling herself the truth would only destroy something that, by every practical measure, was already working perfectly well. She said the hardest part, looking back now, was not the original decision itself, but the 27 years of small daily choices required to maintain it, every school form that asked for a father's medical history, every extended family gathering where someone commented on a resemblance that was not actually genetic at all. Every single one of those moments requiring its own tiny, deliberate act of continued silence. I left her apartment that night without saying much else, driving aimlessly for almost 2 hours before I finally called Priya, my closest friend since college, and told her everything, the transplant, the test, Victor Suarez, all of it spilling out in the strange flat voice you use when your brain has not yet decided how it feels about something enormous. Priya asked me the only question that actually mattered in that moment. Not whether I was angry, not whether I felt betrayed, but simply whether I still wanted to save Robert's life, and I remember answering yes almost before she finished the question, because nothing about a blood test had changed a single memory of him teaching me to shave or crying quietly at my college graduation. The problem, of course, was that wanting to save him and being medically able to were now two entirely separate questions, since I was no longer a viable donor match on paper, and the transplant team needed to move quickly to identify other possibilities while Robert's kidney function continued its slow, frightening decline. Dr. Patel explained the mechanics of it to me again, more slowly this time, now that the shock had at least partially worn off, telling me that the human immune system is built specifically to recognize and attack anything it identifies as foreign, which is exactly why a closer genetic match dramatically reduces the risk of organ rejection after surgery, and exactly why the panel had been run with such uncompromising precision in the first place. She told me stories, carefully anonymized, of other transplant cases where similar genetic surprises had emerged over her 15 years in the field, a woman who learned during a liver workup that her sister was actually her half-sister, a teenager who discovered an entire biological family he never knew existed after a routine bone marrow registry search. Each story a small reminder that the human body keeps records the rest of us are not always given access to. I asked her, half joking and half desperate for some kind of certainty in a week that had offered me none, whether these situations ever resolved cleanly, and she smiled the tired, honest smile of someone who has genuinely seen it all, telling me that clean was rarely the right word, but that most families, given enough time and enough willingness to actually talk to one another, eventually found something workable, even if it looked nothing like what they had originally pictured. I went back to see him the next morning, terrified of how my face might give something away, and he looked up at me from his hospital bed with the same exhausted warmth he had greeted me with my entire life, asking only when the test results were coming back, completely unaware that they already had, and that they had detonated quietly in a private office 2 floors below him. I told him, eventually, because I had already learned enough from my own childhood confusion about secrets to know that another hidden truth in this family was the last thing any of us actually needed, and I watched his face move through disbelief, then something like grief. Though not for himself, entirely for me, for what this meant about the years my mother had spent choosing silence over honesty. He held my hand the exact same way he had the night I first arrived at that hospital and told me with a steadiness that undid me completely, that a piece of paper measuring genetic markers had absolutely no authority to rewrite 27 years of bedtime stories, skinned knees, and every single ordinary Tuesday we had spent simply being father and son. The transplant team, meanwhile, had begun the difficult work of locating alternative donors, testing distant relatives on Robert's side who turned out, one after another, to be poor matches, while the clock on his declining kidney function ticked forward with the specific cruelty of medical timelines that refused to pause for anyone's emotional reckoning. It was Priya, of all people, who eventually asked the question none of us had wanted to voice out loud, whether Victor Suarez, my apparent biological father, might himself be a viable donor match, a suggestion that landed in my chest like a stone, both because it made obvious clinical sense and because it meant tracking down a stranger and asking him to save a man's life who was not, technically, related to him at all. Finding Victor took less time than I expected, a few phone calls through my mother, a tense conversation where she explained, haltingly, why a grown man she had not seen in decades was suddenly resurfacing in her life with a request no reasonable person could have anticipated receiving on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Victor agreed to meet me at a coffee shop near the hospital, a stocky, quiet man in his late 50s with tired eyes and hands that shook slightly around his coffee cup, and I remember searching his face across the table for some involuntary flicker of recognition, some genetic echo I could point to and finally understand. He told me he had wondered, briefly, all those years ago, whether the timing lined up in a way that mattered, but that he had respected my mother's decision to stay with Robert, and had never once tried to insert himself into a family that seemed, from a careful distance, to already be whole and happy without him. He told me, too, something I had not expected at all, that he had actually seen me once, from a distance, at a Little League game when I was maybe 9 years old, having driven past the field on a whim after hearing through a mutual acquaintance which weekend my games usually took place, and that he had sat in his car in the parking lot for exactly 1 inning before deciding it was not his place to walk any closer. He said he never married, never had other children, and that for years he told himself the reason was simply bad luck or bad timing, though sitting across from me now in that coffee shop, he admitted quietly that some part of him had probably always been waiting for a conversation exactly like this one, without ever letting himself consciously hope for it. I Asked him whether he was angry at my mother, whether decades of silence had curdled into resentment somewhere along the way, and he shook his head slowly, telling me that anger was a luxury he had decided a long time ago after a great deal of quiet thinking, not to spend his limited energy on, that whatever had happened, it had resulted in a healthy, apparently well-raised son sitting across the table from him, and that felt like more than he had any right to be angry about. When I explained why I was really there, the transplant, the failing kidneys, the increasingly narrow window of time, Victor set down his coffee cup very slowly and asked me one simple question: whether the man in that hospital bed was a good father. And when I said yes, immediately and without hesitation, he nodded once and told me he would take the compatibility test that same week. The results came back 9 days later, and this time when Dr. Patel called me into her office, I braced myself instinctively for another impossible complication, another twist this family clearly had no shortage of, but instead she told me with the closest thing to genuine excitement I had seen from her yet, that Victor Suarez was an excellent match, healthy, willing, and biologically capable of giving Robert exactly what he needed. I sat with that information for a long time before I brought it to Robert, unsure how a man could possibly process the idea of receiving a kidney from the biological father of the son he had raised as entirely his own, a tangle of loyalty and gratitude and old quiet grief that no medical consent form was ever designed to capture. Robert, when I finally told him, was quiet for almost a full minute, staring at the ceiling of his hospital room before he said something I have thought about nearly every single day since, that if this man was willing to give him a piece of his own body to save the life of the son they now, strangely and unexpectedly, shared between them, then he would accept that gift with the same gratitude he would accept it from anyone else who loved. The surgery took place on a grey Tuesday morning in late autumn, 2 operating rooms running simultaneously down the same hallway. Victor Suarez in one, Robert Ortiz in the other, 2 men who had been near strangers 3 weeks earlier now permanently and literally connected by a single functioning organ, and one deeply complicated son standing anxiously in the waiting room between them. I remember the specific, almost unbearable stillness of that hospital hallway in the early morning hours before either surgery began, fluorescent lights humming overhead, a vending machine cycling loudly every few minutes, and the strange realization that I was quite possibly the only person in the entire building who fully understood the improbable, tangled history connecting the 2 men currently being wheeled into separate operating rooms just a few dozen feet apart. A nurse I had gotten to know over the previous weeks squeezed my shoulder on her way past and told me gently that she had worked transplant cases for almost a decade and had genuinely never once seen a donor and recipient relationship quite like this one, which somehow made me feel both less alone in the strangeness of it and slightly more aware of exactly how unusual my own life had recently become. I called Priya from a plastic chair in that waiting room somewhere around hour 3, mostly just to hear a familiar voice, and she reminded me of something I badly needed reminding of in that moment, that whatever happened in the next few hours, I had already done the hardest part myself, finding Victor, asking the impossible question, holding an entire fractured family together with nothing but persistence and a stubborn refusal to let anyone quietly disappear from this story. I sat in that waiting room for 6 hours doing the specific kind of praying you do when you have stopped believing prayer changes outcomes but keep doing it anyway because the alternative is simply sitting there doing nothing at all. And when the surgeon finally walked out and told me both men were stable, I cried harder than I had at any point since that first phone call from the hospital. Recovery took weeks, careful weeks of hospital visits and medication schedules, and Robert slowly regaining color in his face that I had genuinely feared I would never see again, and somewhere in the middle of all of that, something unexpected happened. Victor Suarez started visiting too, first out of simple medical curiosity about how his kidney was performing in its new home then, gradually, because he had quietly become invested in a story he never fully expected to become a permanent part of. The two men were awkward together at first, understandably, two strangers now sharing a piece of tissue. And a complicated, extraordinary connection through the son sitting nervously between them, trying to keep the conversation moving in any direction that felt safe. But somewhere around the third or fourth visit something shifted, and I came in one afternoon to find them quietly discussing a baseball game from the night before as if they had known each other for years rather than weeks, Robert told me privately, once he was strong enough to speak at length again, that he had spent one entire sleepless night before the surgery wrestling with something he was almost embarrassed to admit out loud, a small, irrational fear that receiving Victor's kidney might somehow make him feel less like my father, less entitled to the role he had spent 27 years earning, and that it had taken him hours of quiet thinking to finally understand that fatherhood had never once been stored inside an organ. The doctors monitoring both men called the entire case one of the more unusual living donor arrangements they had personally overseen, not medically complicated. Exactly, but emotionally layered in a way that occasionally left even experienced transplant coordinators unsure what to say during routine follow-up appointments. Watching two men who shared nothing but a scalpel's careful work slowly, cautiously, becoming something like friends. Robert and Victor now sit at the same holiday table twice a year, an arrangement so strange on paper that I still sometimes catch myself laughing quietly at how utterly unplanned it all was, two men who share nothing but a scalpel's worth of connective tissue and one deeply loved, thoroughly confused son sitting between them at every single family dinner. My mother and I are still working through years of silence that a single blood test finally forced into daylight, careful conversations that move slowly, honestly now in a way they never once did during the 27 years she spent hoping the truth would simply stay buried beneath the ordinary business of daily life. We talk now, once a week usually, sometimes about ordinary things, and sometimes about the specific weight of the secret itself. And she has told me more than once that the strangest part of finally being honest is realizing how much smaller the truth actually was than the 27 years of fear she had built up around hiding it. She apologized to Robert directly, eventually, sitting across from him at his own kitchen table on a quiet Sunday afternoon in a conversation I was not in the one thing that actually mattered, and Robert told her in typical fashion that he had already forgiven her the moment he understood the secret had never once changed how much either of them actually loved me, only how long it had taken everyone to say so honestly out loud. There are still hard days, moments where I catch my mother watching me across a room with an expression I can only describe as quiet, lingering guilt, and I have learned to gently remind her the way Robert taught me without ever meaning to, that the goal now is not to relitigate the past, but simply to keep choosing making, and how strange it is that the very same test that revealed a devastating truth about my biology was also the same underlying uncertainty everyone in my family had apparently been carrying without ever fully naming it. Doctors I spoke with afterward, quiet side effect of how thoroughly modern genetic testing has to look in order to keep a transplant patient safe. I have thought about reaching out to a genetic counselor myself at some point, not because I doubt anything Dr. Patel told me, but because I have started to feel a kind of responsibility to understand this part of my own history properly for my own sake and possibly someday for children of my own who deserve an honest, complete account of where they actually come from. Victor has started, slowly, telling me small pieces of his own family history, a grandfather who immigrated with almost nothing, a work ethic he says skipped a generation before apparently landing squarely on me, and I find myself, against every expectation I walked into that coffee shop with, genuinely curious to learn more. He showed me an old photograph once, kept folded in his wallet for decades, of that same grandfather standing outside a small hardware store he eventually managed to buy after years of saving, and he told Me, half joking, that he could already see traces of that same stubborn patience in the careful way I had tracked him down and refused to simply let the whole situation quietly disappear. We have started meeting for coffee every couple of weeks now. Not as father and son exactly, since that title still belongs entirely to Robert, but as something else, something without a clean, existing name, two people permanently linked by biology and one enormous, unplanned favor, slowly building whatever comes next between them one ordinary conversation at a time. If there is one thing I would want anyone listening to this story to genuinely understand, it is that biology can absolutely explain where you came from, but it has never once, in the entire history of families, been the thing that determines who truly, consistently, unconditionally shows up for you when everything else falls apart. I have replayed that phone call from the hospital more times than I could ever count, the number on the screen, the nurse's careful voice, the exact way. My life split cleanly into a before and an after in the span of about 90 seconds, and I no longer think of it as the night everything fell apart. I think of it now as the night an entire family, quietly, imperfectly, finally, started telling each other the truth. People sometimes ask me whether I regret taking that first compatibility test, whether some quieter, simpler version of ignorance might have spared everyone involved a great deal of unnecessary pain, and I always tell them no, immediately and without hesitation, because the alternative was a man I loved more than anyone else on earth slowly dying while I sat beside him, carrying a truth none of us even knew existed yet. Robert still tells people, whenever the story comes up at family gatherings now, that the best decision he ever made was not marrying my mother or even raising me, it was simply refusing every single day for 27 years to let a piece of paper ever have the final say over what a family actually is. And if there is anything else I would want another son or daughter somewhere to take from all of this, sitting in some hospital waiting room of their own, staring down an uncertain diagnosis and an uncertain family history, it is that. The truth, however frightening it seems in the moment right before it arrives, is almost always survivable and almost always, eventually, worth exactly what it costs to finally hear it. Robert Ortiz was, and will always be my father in every single way that has ever actually mattered to me, not because a lab result confirmed it, but because he proved it, quietly and repeatedly, across every ordinary day of 27 years, long before any of us ever knew there was even a question worth asking.